Hi everybody, welcome to this week's edition of Ask Andrew, where you send in your film-related questions and I give you my answers to them. If you have questions yourself, please submit them via the Ask Andrew section of the Film Studies Online page on brynmarfilm.org. Today's first question is, do you think we'll see a Hollywood film featuring known stars shot completely under COVID-19 quarantine? I.e., all the actors shoot their parts at their own homes with their own equipment, then the director splices it all together. Well, I for one can say my immediate reaction to that question is, I hope not. I would be very surprised to see such a movie, but on the other hand, there are lots of things that are being broadcast and put out in the world using video shot at home that I would have been extremely shocked to have seen just a few months ago. So anything is possible. I will say, though, that this seems to me more like a case of the medium driving the content, and I feel like given the ubiquity of at-home video and webcams and things like this, that there isn't sufficient novelty to justify a production made under these circumstances. Early on, when digital video first started out in the very early 2000s, maybe even the late 90s, you would see some sort of medium or technology-driven films, and people had a moderate interest and, I guess, moderate tolerance for them. I don't think that would be the case now, and I also think that many people rely on video conferencing and things like that so much for their work that the last thing they want to do is want to spend time or money to see entertainment made under those conditions. So I'd be really, really surprised to see something like this, but you never know. I've been wrong before, so perhaps something will come out in the next couple months where I'll be really surprised and you'll be proven right. Our next question is, why has it become semi-standard for feature film comedies to run 90 minutes? This is a good question, and I think it states pretty accurately the state of things. Most feature film comedies are right around 90 minutes. I don't have a firm answer for this, but I do have a couple of ideas. One is that film comedies typically aren't so much about the plot as they are about the hijinks that people get into, for lack of a better term, under the sort of auspices of following the plot, for lack of a better term. And in that sense, there's really no point in making the story drag out any longer than necessary. Ideally, you would have your funniest bits, routines, ideas, situations, what have you, that you can take place over the course of as short a plot as possible, so the movie is as chock full of laughs as possible. I think we've all been in the situation where we've seen a trailer for the film and saw one or two really funny bits, and then we were very disappointed to see that those were the two funniest bits in the whole movie and the rest didn't nearly live up to it. So I think part of it is that it's unlikely to have that much comedy that is that good to warrant a film being longer, and such films are usually constructed to contain the comedy and less so, I think, to tell a very specific and detailed story. The other reason I think is that a lot of comedies that are made are romantic comedies, and the sort of crux of a romantic comedy is the couple realizes that they are supposed to be together, that they're supposed to look past or overcome or forget about whatever issue one has with the other and end up together and be a couple. We know that as viewers, and we are waiting for that to happen. Once they realize it, once it dawns on them, which is usually when the humor stops in those films, by the way, we want that part to happen as quickly as possible. The third act in many romantic comedies, if not all of them, is too long as it is. So one of the ways to help avoid that is to make the whole film short. Unfortunately, that doesn't always necessarily follow. But those are a couple of reasons why that might be the case. Our next question is, I finally got around to seeing the original Cape Fear. Max Cady sauntering around in the white hat and suit reminded me a lot of Hannibal Lecter at the very end of Silence of the Lambs. Has Anthony Hopkins ever said Cape Fear was an influence on this scene? Well, it's a very interesting question and a similarity I hadn't thought about until you mentioned it. I have not heard of or read or even been able to find any connection between the two films other than their genre and things like that. So I really don't think that that is an intentional homage. I think that those were two distinct situations where distinct costume designers, at the very least, were thinking about what the character would wear, and that's those respective characters would wear in those respective situations, and costuming them accordingly. I think that while it is possible that Anthony Hopkins himself would have said, "I think he should have this hat," or "I should have a hat," or something like that. It seems unlikely to me that he would have done that, and particularly at that point in his career, that's the movie that made him really a huge star. And the idea that he would have sort of thought to have offered that piece of wardrobing when that wasn't his area at that time seems unlikely. In any case, it would have had to have gotten the okay of the director, Jonathan Demme, who very well may have seen the original Cape Fear and thought of an interesting similarity. But I don't think it was done intentionally or consciously. And I also don't think it was Anthony Hopkins' idea. I'd be really surprised if it were. Our final question for today is, so many fantasy adventure movies of the 1980s that were not based on existing material have become what we now consider classics. Back to the Future, E.T., Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones, Gremlins, Goonies, Karate Kid, Beetlejuice. All had both action and humor, and all were family friendly, at least by 80s standards. It doesn't seem like this kind of broad appeal, timeless content is being produced today. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think that is? Well, this is a really interesting question. I think that I don't necessarily agree with your question, or the premise of your question precisely as it was worded. You say it doesn't seem like this kind of broad appeal, timeless content is being produced today. I think it is. I just think there are a couple of factors that have slightly altered the state of things. I think that that content is being produced. I don't think that it is being produced from original material. As you pointed out in your initial question, I do think that's a difference between then, about 35 or 40 years ago, and now. I do think a much higher percentage of that sort of big budget action comedy blockbuster, family, appropriate more or less, is from pre-existing properties, the biggest examples being Marvel and Star Wars and Harry Potter and so on. I do think there's still a lot of original content that is family friendly being produced, and it is enormously successful, but it's being produced by Disney and other animation studios. And I think that a lot of that has moved into the animation sort of realm. I will grant you not all of that is original and family friendly. As we know, Disney is sort of both taken as source material fairy tales and previously existing material, and they've also started remaking their own material. But I think that that's where you find that sort of largely original work, whether it's an Incredibles or a Toy Story or a Frozen or a Brave, what have you, Moana. I think you find action or adventure and comedy in original premises and materials there. So I think that's one thing. I think part of the problem is the industry has become more risk averse, and it has become more international. Both of those things have happened, I think, since the 1980s. So the risk aversion plays itself out in basing things on previously existing material, things that already have a leg up in marketing because people know of the properties, whether they're superhero movies or Star Wars or based on young adult books or what have you. I think that risk aversion has gotten the better of Hollywood in that regard. I also think that the increased importance on the international market relies on that as well. I think that I shouldn't say relies on that as well, but I think is a related factor as well. I think that selling brand new from scratch properties abroad, unless they are made by someone like Steven Spielberg or George Lucas, is a harder sell. I think you do see new live action, family friendly franchises like Night at the Museum, and that's possible that something like that would be seen as a classic in 10 relative classic in 10 or so years. But I think part of the issue is you don't have filmmakers like Steven Spielberg. Most of those titles you mentioned were in some way related to Steven Spielberg. He made them or was a producer or executive producer, and his brand and his sort of stamp of approval went a long way towards getting those original films made. He doesn't seem to be interested in making that sort of movie much anymore. And I think there isn't someone who sort of stepped into that fold. I think the filmmaker behind the Night of the Museum movies, whose name escapes me, and that tells you something, is perhaps someone who's trying to fill that role. But the fact that his name escapes me should tell you something. So I think that those are some of the factors. I also think that if you think about not all of those, but a lot of those, some of those things like Back to the Future or Goonies, and maybe even no, well, those are two good examples, I guess. Those are sort of culturally specific to America. I'm not saying you couldn't tell those stories or versions of those stories in other countries and cultures, but the way those movies were made and told seemed to me to be kind of specifically American, and in an era where China is as important, if not more important, than the domestic North American box office, that's not going to fly. So I think those are some of the reasons why we don't see that happening as much anymore. But I think if you want those sorts of movies, then you can look at the more family-friendly animated fare, some of which is very good and is as entertaining for adults as it is for kids. So thank you very much for watching this week's installment of Ask Andrew. I would really love to have some more questions to try to answer. So please submit them via the Film Studies online page at our website, brynmarfilm.org, and I hope to see you next time.